Okay, we're back again with our series on William Bartley's book, The Retreat to Commitment. This is the second appendix, and I think it's where things become most interesting as well. He's talking about the logical strength of his theory, and he's going to begin with a look at demarcation as well. But perhaps more importantly, he's going to begin with a gripe, and a gripe against Popperian thought, or at least how Popperian thought has adopted his thought and claimed it as its own. So he begins by saying that in his original work, before the appendices were added, he proposed a generalization of Karl Popper's theory of falsification. And this was a way of separating justificationism from criticism, and one that does so in a way that also forms a separation between verificationism and falsificationism. He goes on to say that it was incredibly useful, and it's been useful to him personally, but to also say that it is his conception, the one that he laid out in The Retreat to Commitment, that is most commonly considered Popperian thought. That whenever someone has a Popperian idea and they couch it in that way, they're always presenting it and interpreting it in terms of his theory, not Popper's. Because, and he lays this out in some detail earlier in the book, that they simply didn't understand the level of justificationism that seeped into some of Popper's, particularly Popper's early work. But Bartley is trying to change things here. And he says that almost as soon as he had achieved that generalization, he began to become a little uncomfortable with it, particularly how it related to parts of Popper's early work. Now, in some ways, this is completely unexceptional. We always expect some new, broader theory to explain and correct what is in the existing theories or the preceding theories. But what Bartley feels most uncomfortable about here is Popper's theory of demarcation. He begins by saying that the issue of demarcation as a philosophical issue is quite important, actually, particularly to the philosophy of religion and the examination and critique of ideology. Indeed, much of the philosophy of this kind throughout the last century, this is the 20th century, is in fact a response to a series of demarcation criteria. Criteria of meaningfulness, or empirical character, or verificationism. But at the beginning of this appendix, Bartley is going to consider a brand new criteria, one that he believes corrects a lot of the errors that existed within Popper's demarcation, and of course moves us beyond how demarcation has existed within that broader philosophy that I've mentioned just there. So when we start with demarcation, the core idea is something like a way to distinguish between a bad idea and a good idea, or a bad practice and a good practice. And of course, we call this the problem of demarcation. And now, at this point, Bartley is not talking about a demarcation between science and non-science, nor meaningful and non-meaningful, or any other of the demarcations that have traditionally existed. Simply that very core beginning idea between a good idea and a bad idea, or a good practice and a bad one. And he begins by offering a very simple way to solve these types of problems without a recourse to philosophy, at least in an incredibly simplified world. So you imagine, as Bartley does here, that you have a choice between one idea and another. And to solve it, you might simply ask your friend. The friend in this case is Harry. Or he says, and I mention Harry's name because Harry's going to come back in this example, but you could do it otherwise. You could simply flip a coin. And he says this is a primitive type of philosophy, in fact, and a primitive type of criticism as well. How do we judge a good idea? Well, it is any idea that Harry approves to be good. And any that he disapproves to be good is a bad idea. The same would sit for heads or tails on the coin flip. The problem is we don't live in a simplified world. And from here you might be thinking, what's the point of all this? Well, Bartley says that the demarcation issue, or the demarcation philosophies that have come about in this much more complicated world in which we live, are simply not much better than asking Harry or flipping a coin. In fact, they are arranged in such a way, just like those two solutions, those two criticisms, to in fact preclude the possibility of ever really answering the question, ever really solving the problem, because they are contaminated, just like the whole world of philosophy is contaminated by justificationism. You can see the obvious justificationism in the coin flip, or the asking of Harry. And of course, Bartley says that in the world of philosophy, it is exactly the same. It's just a little harder to see. But the view always remains the same, that when we think about a theory and how we're going to criticize it, it is always in terms of how it can be justified. And Bartley has a list here of philosophers who have built philosophies based on just this type of criticism, a justificationist criticism. To name a few, we have Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Whitehead, Russell, Wittgenstein, Carnap, Ayer, Ryle, Austin, Quine, Husserl, Heidegger, Barth, Bultmann, Tillich. Justificationism shapes all analytical philosophy, Bartley believes, all phenomenology. They all exist within what we discussed in the last appendix, is the justificationistic metacontext. Now, how does this show up within the philosophy? Well, he has a list of words here. Catchphrases, keys that pop up from time to time within all of the works of all those men he just named. They include verify, probabilify, confirm, make firm, validate, vindicate, prove, make certain, show how to make certain, can make acceptable, authorize, defend, and they go on. What they all have in common, what all these justificationisms have in common, are one, the existence of an authority. Something that can evaluate good from bad simply by its existence. Something in which the demarcation forms around. Two, the idea that goodness or badness, in this case, is to be determined by simply reducing until you get back to that authority. So boiling things down to a statement that would read something like, that which can be so reduced is justified, and that which cannot be reduced is rejected. Now the first step there is to be already found within those two examples. You simply ask Harry, or you flip the coin. The second step moves beyond it a little. And of course note that within that, these requirements that he just laid out do not speak of rational justification, in the sense of a justification that might be approved by rationally minded people or scientists. And he wants to say this, he wants to show this because he is keen to impart upon the reader that justification is sought just as much by rationalists as it is by irrationalists. It's the same mistake and it's incredibly common. Wherever you see justificationism, it has the same structure. Whether it is some local authority, whether it is a local wizard, as he quotes here, or the Ouija board, or observations or sensory reports, or the light of pure reason. And this justificationist pattern ties together a whole range of demarcationist theories that look at perhaps first glance as being very different. Things like good traits versus bad traits, of course, but also true versus false, or distinct versus indistinct, clear versus unclear, demonstrable by reason or undemonstrable, empirical or unempirical, verifiable, unverifiable, meaningful, meaningless, scientific, unscientific. Now, whichever one of these is considered the most important or the most serious simply depends of where you exist within the justificationist meta-context. For Descartes, of course, demarcating good ideas from bad ideas was done by reducing to clear and distinct ideas. For Hume, good ideas are demarcated by finding the empirical nature, or which ones are empirical, which can be reduced to reports of sensory data, sensory observation. The ones which are considered on the wrong side of this ledger, the wrong side of the demarcation, are simply ones that are undesirable in respect to the already designed principle. They're considered unclear or confused or poorly related to the evidence and so on and so on. And the items on that list here, though Bartley is keen to denigrate them all as wrong, he does give them at least the credit of saying they have staying power. They've infected all of Western philosophy. And even though they may now be dismissed in some way, or at least regarded as insufficient, they're still heavily prized by many in the world of philosophy. For example, let's talk about a core on that, truth. Now, there is no modern philosophy, or no serious modern philosophy, that claims to have achieved a criteria for truth. And yet, all such philosophies still consider truth to be a good trait. Yet it is obvious, as Bartley says, that truth is not sufficient. For example, a theory which is false, but in fact has high empirical content, may be preferable to a trivial truth or a tautological truth. And of course, Bartley is writing during the time of Popper. So he has a particular eye on the contemporary philosophies and the items on that list that he has just put forward, which they are most cleanly attached to at the time. Those most commonly related to probability, which he talks about in terms of forms of positivism, empiricism, meaningfulness, and verificationism. It doesn't matter where you run within the history of the philosophy of science, but ever since Immanuel Kant, demarcation has been a keen focus of the philosophy of science, and as well as a keen focus within the rationalist tradition, all the way to the point where Bartley believes they invade our culture into almost every aspect of it, which of course is a problem. But when you look at the irrationalist side of this, They have a different type of honesty and acceptance of what they're doing. For example, theologians would cite as inherently good demarcation traits, perhaps endorsement by the Pope, or endorsement by the Bible, or endorsement by some other religious authority. And they would admit exactly what they're doing here. They're appealing to an authority, and they're appealing towards justificationism. And of course, you could still have different versions of this within religion itself. You can have an appeal to the conscience, or appeal to some sort of inner spiritual light. But almost in all cases, the people claiming this, the irrationalists, are clear about what they're doing. It is only us rationalists that can't see the stain that we are leaving behind. But we really should have noticed it, because any theory of demarcation that is set up in this way produces another kind of problem, which Bartley calls the problem of logical strength. And this arises when a particular statement or a particular policy which is under consideration, although not conflicting with authorities, produces a logical strength which is greater than the authorities themselves, or greater than the combined strength of the authority. Something which cannot be reduced or derived from those authorities, and which therefore must be considered as not being sanctioned by those authorities, not logically sanctioned. The problem, of course, is that any justificationist account and any demarcation set up upon it will be done so with the expectation that those set authorities are enough in themselves to sanction good theories and good policies, and that anything which is not reducible to those authorities should therefore be rejected. And if you're thinking to yourself, this might sound like a parochial issue, that I can see what is wrong with this type of theory without thinking back to, or at least making some sort of angled direction towards logical strength. Bartley says it like this. He says, such problems arise all the time. And he says, most of the history of philosophy and almost all of the history of epistemology is simply the history of problems of logical content. And if people understood this and saw this, then a lot of these mistakes would have been dismissed or could have been dismissed almost immediately. And he's going to get into the details of that here and explain just what he means by that in a bit more context, of course. But he is going to at least drill down on particularly one aspect of that, one which was riding high at the time in which he was alive. And this is the empiricist approach to demarcation, those which take as authorities sensory observation. So with some examples and with some details, just what does Bartley mean by the problem of logical strength, or the issue of logical strength? Well, let's take a statement. And the one Bartley used here is the example of John is tall. So the person of John, and claim that he is a tall person. Now this statement says less than another statement, which is John is both tall and thin. Both are statements about the world, and yet they differ in their content, and they differ in their logical strength. And take another example then. Imagine you have a normal six-sided die in your hand, and you make the statement that on the next roll, this die will turn up with a 3. In both cases, the case of John and the die, you are making a prediction about the world, or a theory about the world in which you expect to turn out to be true. So if you then change that theory about the die to say on the next roll this will be either a 3 or a 5, well, that next statement has less strength to it, less predictive power. And perhaps it makes more sense when you imagine a final scenario, which is the claim that on the next roll this die will turn up as a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5, or even a 6. Now, this is a claim about the world, yes, but it also makes no assertion whatsoever. It's true. Its content is entirely nothing, though. It doesn't say anything about the world. It explains nothing. It gives no insight. It makes no predictions. Its content is nil. And so, therefore, its logical strength is also nil. And the role of logical content plays an important part in all valid argument and all valid derivation. And so, therefore, also in all justificationism. It's a fairly elementary point of logic, a claim about what a derivation must look like, which is, of course, when the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. That if a conclusion can be derived from those premises, then it is either equal to or less than in terms of logical strength to those premises. And in no circumstances can a stronger statement ever be legitimately derived from a weaker one. So let's begin with a statement which is in fact equal, where the conclusion is the same equal strength to the premises, which is, well, as Bartley puts here, my cat is Siamese is the premises, and the conclusion is my cat is Siamese. Of course, absolutely true, absolutely derived, and absolutely equal. In fact, identical, and tells us absolutely nothing about the world, other than what was already there in the premises. And of course, here is also an obvious case whereby it is impossible for that premises to be true without the conclusion also being true. Now, consider another example. The premises is slightly changed in this example. The premises is now, my cat is Siamese and my cat is male. The conclusion is, my cat is Siamese. Now, this is a valid argument. The premises is not equal to the conclusion. In fact, they're stronger than the conclusion, richer in content than the conclusion. Because if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Okay, let's move on to an invalid example. Same cat. So, my cat is Siamese. This is the premises. The conclusion is, my cat is Siamese and my cat is male. Now, this is invalid, of course. The conclusion is stronger than the premises. Now, both may be true, the conclusion and the premises. But that is a factor which has nothing to do with the argument being claimed. Nothing is contingent. The conclusion here need not be true, even if the premises is. The cat could be both Siamese and female, for example. And from the argument, that's not excluded as a possibility. So why is Bartley talking about cats? Why is he laying this out for us in this way? In, I suppose, fairly elementary way? Because, as I mentioned, he believes that an understanding of logical strength will help us dismiss a lot of the justificationism out of hand, or we notice it straight away. But also because he wants to go on and show us that logic need not be justificationist. Now, a lot of those examples there would lead people to think perhaps it has to be. There has to be a derivation, it has to be justified in some way. The conclusion has to be justified in terms of the premises. And how else can you form a principle of logic or logical structure in any other way? Well, Bartley thinks this isn't necessary. He thinks it's a fairly simple mistake, and he's going to show us how to do that right now. Bartley believes that many of the problems of philosophy are simply problems of logical strength. That when you look at these different situations and lay them out, they're simply situations where those outcomes which are considered either desirable or undesirable, either way, they're simply too strong to be derived from those available authorities. And if you could only recognize that, then we could throw away the whole idea. And for this small example, he's going to start with the problem of induction. And the second problem he's going to use is one of ethics, which is the ought-is problem. Now, the problem of induction, of course, is one of science, or at least the philosophy of science. But the ought-is one is one about, I suppose, a well-known mistake, which was put forward by Hume, of course, which says we cannot derive ought conclusions from descriptive premises, which are is premises. No description of the world will tell you how you ought to act within the world. Or at least perhaps, if you can lay it out a little more closely, no description of the world is enough to derive how we ought to act within the world. The key here is derive. We're talking about logic. In both cases, the problem of induction and the problem of ought is, we have statements about the world and merits which need to be decided upon. Scientific projections of the future, or universal statements, and in the second case, evaluative judgments, and in both cases, how to justify the statements at hand. So let's begin with induction, and this is how he lays it out. So the premises is this: Mars is a planet that moves in an ellipse. Second premise, Jupiter is a planet that moves in an ellipse, and third premise is Earth is a planet that moves in an ellipse. The conclusion being, and this is an inductive conclusion, all planetoid objects move in ellipses. Now, of course, inductive reasoning is invalid. The movement of Mars and Jupiter and Earth tells us nothing about what other planets are doing. Well, perhaps change that. The observation of the movement of Mars, Jupiter, and Earth does not tell us what other planets must move like. The possibility always exists for another planetoid object that, when discovered, does not move in an ellipse. So, in this case, it is possible for our premises to be true and our conclusion false. Now, the problem for the issue of induction here might be obvious to some people, but I'm going to lay it out here, which is that universal laws of science, applying as they always do as we create our theories about the world, to infinite cases, infinite possibilities. So you create a law about the movement of planets. Well, it's a universal law. It must apply to all planets. And yet, when we form this particular law, We can only ever do so, if we are trying to derive it inductively, of course, we can ever do so from a finite number of cases. No matter how large the observation that we bring to bear upon this, it's always going to pale in comparison to the size of the law and the claim and the reach of the law itself. Meaning, in terms of logical strength, that the conclusion of inductive reasoning simply is too large, has way too much logical strength to ever be derived from the premises. So that's the imbalance that Bartley is talking about here. And the kind of imbalance that when we notice it in logic, we ought to be able to throw out the theory immediately. So let's move to ethics and the is-ought distinction. So let's begin with this. The premises is I like X, and the conclusion being X is good. Now this argument is also invalid, of course, because the conclusion is talking about goodness, and yet the premises is simply talking about matters of fact and past experience. The fallacy is, of course, deriving an ought statement from an is statement, or at least attempting to. And for many people, they'll say that this is why this particular argument is invalid. But it's not. The argument is invalid simply because, as it sits there, as it is laid out, there is no relation between the premises and the conclusion at all. Now, this can be done. You can create such a formula. Perhaps try this one. The premises are this. I like X. That's premises 1. Premises 2 is, whatever I like is good. And the conclusion being, X is good. Now the argument itself is valid. The premises and the conclusion are related. But it is also no longer an attempt to derive a evaluative conclusion from premises which are purely factual. You are no longer deriving an ought from an is. The claim to an ought is already smuggled into the premises. Of course, it runs in parallel to the problem of induction, as it might apply to a similar situation of ought and is. Imagine these premises. I like X, and X is good. Premises 2, I like Y, and Y is good. Premises 3, I like Z, and Z is good. The conclusion being, whatever I like is good. Now, the argument is invalid, of course. It's an inductive argument. But the reason why, of course, why it's invalid, has nothing to do with the presence of factual statements in the premises and evaluative statements in the conclusion. The ought-is distinction is not the problem here. The premises themselves are not purely factual. They are evaluative. They claim that X is good and Y is good and Z is good. But even if they were purely factual, it would still be false. The argument would still be invalid, simply because it's inductive. And all inductive arguments are false or invalid because the conclusions are always stronger than the collective strength of the premises. So what are some of the other traditional problems of philosophy that Bartley thinks are simply problems of logical strength in the same way? Well, here are a few. The existence of bodies and objects in the world, independent of our sensory observation. The continued real existence of the personal self, the existence of other minds, the uniformity of nature, the existence of the past, the existence of matter, the existence of physical space independent of our own sensory perception, the existence of time independent of our perceptions, and the principles of science, however they are understood. And as you look at that list, it's not some simple, as Bartley writes here, no simple arbitrary list of epistemological problems. That list of problems are the problems that Bertrand Russell lays out in his classic book, The Problems of Philosophy, as well as problems that A.J. Ayer laid out in The Problems of Knowledge and in The Central Questions of Philosophy. And they are also Hume's epistemological problems as he laid out. Now, they all sit there, as you may imagine when you look at them there, as different problems. Bartley's saying they're not different problems. They're all the same problem, simply applied to different subject matters. The problem of logical strength simply applied to different subject matters. So to boil it down, there are two crucial difficulties in any traditional justificationist epistemology. First, the authorities offered are simply too weak to justify the outcomes. This is, of course, the problem of logical strength as we've just laid out there. Secondly, the authorities themselves have shown themselves unable to demarcate good from bad, good ideas from bad ideas. They have failed to achieve the thing that they claim their existence is for. And Bartley is a little frustrated here as he writes. Perhaps rightly so, perhaps he's been through this a lot. He says there's simply been a great neglect within the history of philosophy, where people are just not noticing the underlying structure, which generates these problems again and again and again, without realizing it is one problem undergirding the rest. Instead, what philosophers have tried to do is strengthen those authorities when they've failed, by supplementing them with a priori principles, for example. And this is what Bertrand Russell tried when he produces what he called an a priori principle of induction. simply so that you can then afford a reduction in terms back to that principle. Or secondly, they have attempted to weaken the requirement that justified statements be reducible to authorities at all, or are related to justifiers. Now, doing this, they are once again making use of a type of induction itself. And lastly, what Bartley calls a fashionable approach, or at least when he was writing a fashionable approach, is to claim that the justifiers and the justified statements are only linked informally through alleged rules, such as language games, which is, of course, a reference to Wittgenstein. Now, Bartley believes, and he's going to go on to show here, that the problem of induction, as it always exists, is simply a problem of demarcation, or a problem of demarcation if you approach that problem in terms of justificationism, which is true for all those other problems that he mentioned just earlier. Those great problems of philosophy that people call, and the quote Bartley has here is perennial, the ones that never seem to go away and run from generation to generation. Those so-called insoluble ones that never seem to show any type of progress whatsoever. That's simply due to what he calls here unconscious and uncritical justificationism. So after this grand entry, we should ask Bartley just what a non-justificationist project would look like. And is such a thing even possible within science and within logic? Perhaps more specifically, what does non-justificationist criticism look like? Is it not necessary, and this is how the traditional argument has gone, that to have effective criticism, you need to have some sort of authority, something which is beyond criticism or unchallengeable, and something which those good ideas are all reducible to in some way, or derivable from, or justifiable in relation to. So Bartley's going to start showing how this can be done otherwise with a two-step process. Now, I've just realized upon recording this that the recording has run for well over an hour, so I'm going to cut it here. And this is not the most convenient spot to cut it, I know that. But there simply isn't one in this particular podcast and this particular appendices. So I simply must encourage the listeners to go and listen to the second half of this. The second half I might wind back about a minute just to give people a little bit of a lead in to where we're going. But for now I'll leave it here. And please join us for the second half.